At the age of 95, Clint Eastwood is still regarded as one of the greatest icons of American cinema. A man whose career spanning more than 7 decades has left a profound mark on Hollywood history. From his early days entering the film industry in the 1950s to becoming one of the world's most respected directors and actors, Eastwood has appeared in or directed more than 60 films, many of which have become classics. He made a powerful impression with the character the Man with No Name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy, including A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, films that completely transformed the Western genre. Later, he became a pop culture icon with the role of Inspector Harry Callahan in Dirty Harry, a character etched into the memory of millions of viewers. However, Eastwood's greatest achievements go beyond acting to his work as a director. He won 2 Oscars for Best Director with Unforgiven in 1992 and Million Dollar Baby in 2004, with both films also winning Best Picture at the Academy Awards. In addition, Eastwood has received many other prestigious awards, such as Golden Globe Awards, the AFI Life Achievement Award, and Lifetime Achievement honors from various international film festivals, making him one of the very few artists to achieve massive success as both an actor and a legendary director. But behind those brilliant accomplishments lies a life shaped by years of hardship, failure, and loss. Eastwood was born during the Great Depression, when America was plunged into the worst economic crisis in its history, and his childhood was marked by poverty and constant family moves in search of a livelihood. Before becoming a star, he was outright fired by Hollywood while working for Universal Pictures because he was deemed untalented and with no future on screen. In his early career years, he had to accept small roles, face disdain, and was nearly forgotten in the film industry. His personal life was also full of upheavals and loneliness, with many relationships falling apart, controversies, and scandals that repeatedly put him in the media spotlight. Over the years, he also had to watch many close colleagues and friends pass away one by one, leaving huge voids in his life. Yet it was precisely those challenges that forged Clint Eastwood's iron will. He didn't give up when rejected, didn't stop when considered outdated, and didn't leave cinema even when age forced most of his contemporaries to retire. That enduring resilience turned Eastwood from a dismissed actor into a living Hollywood legend, proving that a person's true strength lies not in glory, but in the ability to rise after every pain life brings. If the story of Clint Eastwood's nearly century-long journey moves you, please subscribe to the channel and hit like so we can continue exploring the extraordinary life of this man. Behind the spotlight of a Hollywood legend, Clint Eastwood's story must return to a very different place, a poor and unstable America in the early 20th century. Clint Eastwood was born on May 31, 1930, in San Francisco, California, during a period when the country was deeply mired in the greatest economic crisis of modern history, the Great Depression. When Clint came into the world crying, millions of Americans had lost their jobs, banks were collapsing, and many families struggled daily just to survive. The Eastwood family was no exception. His father, Clinton Eastwood Sr., was a hard-working man, but fate was rarely kind. He took whatever job he could find, from laborer to factory worker to odd temporary gigs. But in the Great Depression, even hard work didn't guarantee stability. Jobs came and went. Money was always short, and the family's future hung by a thread. Because of this, Clint's childhood wasn't tied to any fixed home. His family constantly moved from one city to another across California in search of better opportunities. One day they were in San Francisco. A few months later, they had to move to Oakland, then Sacramento, then small towns where his father hoped to find new work. The moves happened so frequently that Clint barely had time to get used to one place before leaving. For a child, that meant no long-term friends, no stable school, and no real sense of belonging anywhere. While other kids grew up in familiar neighborhoods, Clint Eastwood grew up among suitcases that were never fully unpacked. Young Clint gradually became a quiet child, not because he didn't want friends, but because he understood those connections would soon end when the family moved again. So Clint learned to keep his distance. He observed more than he spoke, he listened more than he shared. In his small world, Clint Eastwood began forming the reserved and introspective personality that audiences worldwide would instantly recognize on screen later. Perhaps those wandering years taught Clint an early lesson. Don't depend on anyone too much, and don't let others see your weaknesses. Family life wasn't always easy. When money was scarce, tension was unavoidable. Clint's parents worried about every meal and every small expense. In those makeshift rented homes, young Clint often saw anxiety etched on the adults' faces. Those memories aren't the joyful childhood recollections many people have. They are memories of silence, simple meals, and the feeling that life could change at any moment. It was in that environment that Clint Eastwood learned to stand on his own. No one taught him to be tough life, taught him that. He didn't complain. He didn't seek pity. Instead, he watched the world around him with calm eyes, as if memorizing everything. Many years later, when audiences saw Clint Eastwood on screen with his cold stare and few words, they thought it was acting style. But the truth is that man had been shaped long before Hollywood ever knew his name. Clint Eastwood's childhood wasn't a tale of glamour or luck. It was the story of a child growing up amid economic crisis, endless moves, feelings of displacement and loneliness. But those very difficult years built the foundation for the man the world later came to know, a quiet, resilient man who was almost impossible to break. In the silence of a poor childhood, Clint Eastwood learned endurance, and perhaps that very capacity to endure helped him survive the harsh ups and downs of Hollywood for nearly a century. Clint Eastwood's young adult years continued in the same quiet and uncertain way as his childhood. After leaving school and before Hollywood ever heard the name Clint Eastwood, he was just a tall, quiet young man trying to find his place in an America that had just emerged from war. In 1951, Eastwood served in the United States Army and was assigned to Fort Ord in California. Military life for him then wasn't about glory or adventure. It was just another phase in the journey of a young person who still didn't know where the future would take him. But it was during this time that an incident occurred, one that many years later Eastwood still referred to as the moment he looked death straight in the face. It was a dark night in the California sky. Eastwood was allowed on a small military flight, a Douglas A.D. Skyraider training bomber plane. The flight seemed like just a short and routine trip. No one on board thought it would turn into a fight for survival. As the plane flew over the Pacific coast, a malfunction occurred. The engine began to lose power. In a few tense minutes, the pilot realized the plane was gradually losing control. There was no other choice. They would have to make an emergency landing on the water. Below them was the pitch-black ocean of the Pacific, cold and endless. No city lights, no ships, just darkness and waves. As the plane plunged down, everything happened very fast. The sound of metal shuddering violently, the wind howling outside the fuselage. Then a terrifying impact as the plane smashed into the freezing water. In that moment, Eastwood understood that if he didn't act immediately, he would die. He had to get out of the plane. No time to think. No time to be afraid. Eastwood jumped into the pitch-black ocean water. The collision with the cold water felt like it paralyzed his entire body. The nighttime ocean temperature cut into his flesh like thousands of tiny knives. His breathing became rapid. In near-total darkness, he couldn't see the shore, couldn't know how far he was from land. All Eastwood knew was that he had to swim. If he stopped, the cold would kill him before dawn. He started swimming in the darkness. Heavy strokes cut through the cold water. His body gradually lost heat. Waves slapped his face, making it hard to keep his breathing steady. There was nothing but endless ocean around him. No light, no sound, just the noise of water and the pounding of his heart in his chest. In those moments, Eastwood truly believed his life could end right there in the dark night, in the freezing ocean, when he was just a young man who hadn't achieved anything yet. But Eastwood kept swimming, minute after minute, mile after mile. He didn't know how long he had been swimming. He only knew his body was starting to exhaust, but his will forced him to continue. Finally, in the distant darkness, a faint shoreline began to appear. It was the coast near Point Reyes, where the cold Pacific waves crashed onto a desolate sandy beach. Eastwood summoned his last reserves of strength to swim toward shore. When his feet touched the sand, he nearly collapsed from exhaustion. That night, Clint Eastwood survived. But what mattered more was that the night changed him. Before that moment, Eastwood was just a young man trying to find direction in his life. After that moment, he understood that life is more fragile than anyone imagines. Life can end in just a few seconds in engine failure, a plane crash, a cold night on the ocean. And when a person has looked death so closely, they start to see the world differently. Many years later, when Clint Eastwood stepped into Hollywood, when he faced rejections, failures, and doubts, the memory of that night still lingered somewhere in his mind. Because a man who swam through the ocean in the dark to reclaim his life won't easily give up in the face of any challenge. And perhaps it was in the cold night of 1951 that Clint Eastwood learned the most important lesson of his life: that every day you survive is already a victory, and if fate has given him one more chance to keep living, he would never waste it. After that fateful night in the freezing ocean in 1951, Clint Eastwood returned to solid ground with a feeling he had never had before. Life is too short to live without daring to try. In the years that followed, as America entered the post-war economic boom, thousands of young men flocked to Southern California in search of opportunity. Hollywood at that time was like a giant dream where nobodies could become legends overnight. Eastwood was no different from them. Tall, angular face, naturally cold eyes. He carried a vague hope that film could be his path. No one in his family had ever worked in the arts. No one in the towns where he grew up thought that quiet boy would step into the glamorous world of Hollywood. But Eastwood still tried. His first steps in the film industry were far from glorious. Eastwood wandered through small auditions, fleeting extra roles in B-movies, parts so minor that audiences didn't even have time to remember his face. But then a small opportunity appeared when he signed a contract with the major studio Universal Pictures. For an unknown young actor, that was like a golden door swinging open. Eastwood believed this could be the start of a bright future. He worked hard to learn acting, trained his voice, and waited for his first big role. But Hollywood isn't a place of patience. It's a ruthless industry where talent must be proven immediately or be replaced. Just a few years after signing the contract, Eastwood's dream began to crumble. The small roles he got didn't impress the producers. Some directors said he was too stiff in front of the camera. Others complained that he spoke too slowly, his voice too deep and lacking expression. In an industry where actors had to show strong emotions, Eastwood was seen as too cold. One day, he was called into the office of a studio executive. That meeting lasted only a few minutes, but it left a deep scar in Eastwood's memory for the rest of his life. The executive looked straight at him and said bluntly, "You will never be a star." The reasons given were very simple. They said Eastwood didn't have enough talent. They said the way he talked was too slow. They said his face was too rigid, unable to convey emotion. And finally, they concluded that Hollywood had no place for an actor like him. Just like that, Eastwood's contract was terminated. No farewell, no words of encouragement. Just a door closing. Eastwood left the Universal headquarters in silence. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't try to convince them to change their decision. Perhaps part of him had grown accustomed to rejection long before from the years of poverty in his childhood, from the constant family moves, from the feeling that he was always standing outside other people's world. But this time, the pain was different. Because this wasn't just losing a job, this was losing his dream. In the days that followed, Clint Eastwood returned to the ordinary life of a young man with no clear future. He took on odd jobs to make ends meet, digging swimming pools, working as a laborer, accepting anything that could pay the rent. Hollywood was still there, just a few miles away, but it suddenly felt farther than ever. Movies continued to be made, new stars kept emerging, and the film industry kept running as if Clint Eastwood had never existed. There were nights when he lay awake wondering if the people at Universal had been right. Maybe they had seen something he couldn't see. Maybe he really didn't have the talent. Maybe the dream of becoming an actor was just an illusion of a boy who grew up in poverty. At that point, Clint Eastwood was just a name that Hollywood had decided to forget. His film dream, at least in that moment, seemed to have died. After the day he walked out of the Universal Pictures office, Clint Eastwood was no longer a hopeful young actor. He was just a tall man trying to survive in a city where thousands of people's dreams were crushed every day. Hollywood kept operating like a giant machine, creating new stars, new movies, new faces. But Clint Eastwood wasn't among them. To the film industry at that time, he had almost vanished. The following years are the least mentioned period in Eastwood's story. But they were the years that shaped the man he became. With no studio contract, no steady income, Eastwood was forced to take whatever work could help him pay the rent. At times he dug swimming pools, standing under the blazing sun for hours with calloused hands from hard labor. At other times, he did other grueling manual jobs that Hollywood never mentions when talking about movie legends. By day, he worked to survive. By night, he still held on to a vague hope that one day the movies would call his name again. Occasionally, Eastwood still went to auditions, but most opportunities were for such small roles that audiences could barely notice him. Bit parts as soldiers, nameless cowboys, characters who appeared for a few minutes and then disappeared. No name on the poster, no memorable lines, just fleeting figures on screen. Each time he took a role like that, Eastwood told himself that maybe this would be the start of something bigger. But then the movie ended, and everything went back to square one. Hollywood didn't hate him. It simply didn't remember him. Those years passed slowly. Eastwood turned 30 without a single truly noteworthy role. In an industry where many stars had become famous while still very young, 30 was sometimes considered too late to start. There were times when he wondered if the people at Universal back then had been right. Maybe they had foreseen what he didn't want to accept, that Clint Eastwood might just be a name destined to fade into oblivion. Then an unexpected opportunity appeared. In the late 1950s, Eastwood was invited to audition for a new cowboy television series called Rawhide. The show was about cattle drivers leading herds across the American West, a familiar story in television at the time. Eastwood was cast as Rowdy Yates, a hot-headed but loyal young cowboy. For Eastwood, this wasn't a big role in film. It was just a part in a TV series. But after years of being forgotten, simply appearing regularly on screen was already something precious. Rawhide quickly became one of the most popular cowboy series on American television. The show ran for 8 seasons, from 1959 to 1965. Throughout that time, Clint Eastwood appeared in hundreds of episodes, becoming a familiar face to TV audiences. For the first time in his life, he had a steady job in the entertainment industry. But even as Rawhide succeeded, Eastwood still wasn't the star he had once dreamed of becoming. In the eyes of Hollywood, television and film were two very different worlds. Movie stars often looked down on television as a smaller, less prestigious playground. So even though Eastwood appeared weekly on the small screen, many film producers still didn't consider him a noteworthy actor. To them, Clint Eastwood was just a familiar face in a cowboy TV show, nothing more. The years on Rawhide brought Eastwood enough money to live, but not the recognition he craved. He still hadn't become a movie star. He still hadn't had a role that made the whole world take notice. With each passing year, the anxiety inside him grew. What would happen when Rawhide ended? That was the question that haunted Eastwood for years. He looked around and saw other TV actors, people who had once been very famous in their series, disappear from the entertainment industry right after their shows ended. Hollywood seemed to forget them. No new roles, no second chances. Eastwood began to fear that he would share the same fate, that after years of hard work, his life would only be remembered as a mid-tier TV actor in an old cowboy series, that one day Rawhide would end, and Clint Eastwood would once again become a name Hollywood no longer needed. At that point, he couldn't know that just a few years later, a bold decision would completely change his destiny. But during those years of being overlooked, Clint Eastwood was still just a man, clinging to his film dream, a dream that seemed the whole world had forgotten. The final years of Rawhide passed with Clint Eastwood in a state of quiet anxiety. He had spent nearly a decade on the small screen, but Hollywood still didn't see him as a real movie star. As the seasons of Rawhide drew to a close, Eastwood understood that if nothing changed, his career could end like so many other TV actors, quietly fading away. It was at that very moment that a strange opportunity appeared from a place no one in Hollywood truly respected: Italy. A young Italian director named Sergio Leone was looking for an American actor for a cowboy movie he planned to shoot in Spain. The film had a low budget, was produced outside the Hollywood studio system, and almost no major stars wanted to be involved. Leone had watched Rawhide and saw something in Clint Eastwood that others didn't: the silence, the cold gaze, the minimally expressive face. Leone believed that what Hollywood saw as flaws were actually strengths. He wanted Eastwood to star in his new film titled A Fistful of Dollars. When that offer came, Eastwood was at a dangerous crossroads in his career. Rawhide was about to end. Hollywood still didn't consider him a movie star, but the proposal from Leone made many people around him laugh. Industry insiders called it a spaghetti western, a mocking term for cheap cowboy movies made by Italians. In the eyes of Hollywood producers, this wasn't a career step forward. It was a step backward. Some even advised Eastwood to turn it down. They said joining a low-budget foreign film could completely destroy whatever slim chance he had left in Hollywood. Eastwood listened to all those warnings, but he also understood one thing very clearly. He didn't have many opportunities left. If Rawhide ended and he was still just a mid-tier TV actor, Hollywood might never call his name again. So instead of playing it safe, Clint Eastwood decided to take the gamble. He accepted Sergio Leone's offer and flew to Spain to shoot the film that almost all of Hollywood thought was a mistake. The production of A Fistful of Dollars was far from glamorous. The low budget made everything simple and harsh. The western towns in the film were actually small villages in the Spanish desert. Costumes were reused. Props weren't perfect, but Sergio Leone had a vision very different from traditional Hollywood westerns. Instead of talkative heroes who always won honorably, Leone wanted to create a mysterious, laconic, and dangerous character. Eastwood suggested small details for his role: the poncho, the cigar, the cold stare piercing through opponents. The character didn't even have a name. Audiences later would call him simply the man with no name. When the film was completed and released in 1964, Hollywood's initial reaction was still full of skepticism. But what no one expected happened. A Fistful of Dollars quickly became a box office phenomenon in Europe. Leone's styled tense close-up shots, dramatic music by Ennio Morricone, drawn-out gunfights that left viewers breathless captivated audiences. And at the center of it all was Clint Eastwood, the quiet man with the cold gaze that Hollywood had once deemed lacking in emotion. the film didn't just succeed, it changed the entire Western genre. The two sequels, For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, further solidified Eastwood's position in the eyes of global audiences. The man with no name became a pop culture icon. His small gestures, the way he stood still before drawing his gun, the way he looked at opponents without saying a word, became legendary images. The irony is that the very traits that once caused Hollywood to reject Clint Eastwood, his silence, his slow speech, his minimally expressive face, became what made him stand out from every other actor. Sergio Leone had seen it before the rest of the world. And in just a few short years, Clint Eastwood went from an underrated TV actor to an international movie star. But what mattered most was this: accepting Sergio Leone's offer could have ended his career. Instead, it reborn it. The success of the spaghetti western trilogy turned Clint Eastwood from an underrated TV actor into an international movie star. But Hollywood still hadn't fully accepted him. In the eyes of many American producers at the time, Sergio Leone's films were just a fleeting European phenomenon. Eastwood needed a big role on American soil to prove he wasn't just an Italian cowboy star. That opportunity came in 1971 when he took the role in Dirty Harry. No one at the time could know that this role would completely change the history of American cinema and turn Clint Eastwood into a cultural icon the world would never forget. In Dirty Harry, Eastwood played San Francisco police inspector Harry Callahan. Callahan wasn't the classic heroic cop Hollywood was used to. He was cold, laconic, and willing to cross the boundaries of the law to catch criminals. In an era when America was troubled by rising crime, social unrest, and the crisis of faith in authority, the character Harry Callahan arrived like a storm. Eastwood stepped onto the screen with a massive .44 Magnum in his hand and an unrelenting cold stare. His famous line, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" quickly became one of the most iconic lines in film history. Dirty Harry wasn't just a successful action movie. It became a cultural phenomenon. Audiences lined up at theaters. The character Harry Callahan quickly became a symbol of an America craving order and strength. In the eyes of millions, Clint Eastwood was no longer just an actor. He was the embodiment of a new kind of hero, cold, tough, and uncompromising. The Dirty Harry sequels continued to reinforce that image, making Eastwood one of the biggest box office stars of the 1970s. But along with that fame, a storm of criticism also began to rise. Some film critics argued that Dirty Harry glorified violence and created a dangerous image of law enforcement. Many articles called the character Harry Callahan a symbol of extremist police ideology. Some critics even accused the film of carrying extreme political messages and reflecting dangerous conservative thinking. The criticism was aimed directly at Clint Eastwood, who was seen as the face representing that character. For Eastwood, this was a period full of contradictions. On one hand, he was at the peak of his fame. His films brought in millions of dollars at the box office. He became one of the most powerful actors in Hollywood. Studios were willing to finance whatever projects he wanted to pursue. But on the other hand, he also became the center of heated debates about politics, morality, and violence in cinema. Eastwood wasn't someone who liked public arguments. From childhood, he had grown accustomed to living in silence. So when faced with fierce criticism from critics, he rarely responded. Instead of debating in the press, Eastwood kept working. He began directing many of his own films, finding ways to tell more complex, deeper stories. But the controversies surrounding Dirty Harry never went away. Fame gave Eastwood power he had never had before. He could choose scripts, choose directors, even stand behind the camera himself. But that power also came with another price: isolation. When a person becomes too big an icon, they also become distant from the world around them. Eastwood began to realize that the more famous he became, the harder it was to trust others. Interviews, premieres, the flash of press cameras, all of it made him feel alien. Many in Hollywood respected Eastwood, but plenty looked at him with suspicion. Some critics still saw him as a symbol of on-screen violence. Others believed he was just a simple action star, not a true artist. Eastwood knew those things. But he also understood that fame always comes with prices few people see. Throughout those years, Clint Eastwood continued walking between two worlds. On one side were the audiences, those who loved him, who saw him as an icon of strength and perseverance. On the other side were the critics, those who questioned the messages and influence of the films he was involved in. Between those two worlds, Eastwood remained true to his nature. A quiet man who kept working, kept telling stories in his own way, and it was in that silence that something important was gradually taking shape. Clint Eastwood was no longer just the star of Dirty Harry. He was beginning to become one of the most powerful figures in the film industry, an artist learning to take control of his own creative destiny. But the road ahead still held many challenges, because Hollywood is a ruthless place, and even the greatest legends can't stay at the top forever. The fame and power Clint Eastwood achieved after the success of Dirty Harry took him to the pinnacle of Hollywood. But while his career grew brighter and brighter, Eastwood's personal life became more complicated and painful. The spotlight can make a person great in the public's eyes, but it can also crack the closest relationships. And for Eastwood, the years that followed weren't just a journey of cinematic success, but also a long chain of broken relationships. Before becoming a superstar, Eastwood had married Maggie Johnson in 1953. At that time, he was still just a young actor struggling to find his place in the film industry. Maggie stood by him through the hardest years, when he was unknown, when his rare roles barely paid the rent, when Hollywood hadn't yet heard the name Clint Eastwood. Their marriage lasted many years, and they built a family together, having 2 children. In the eyes of many, Maggie was the woman who stood by Eastwood when he had nothing. But when fame arrived, everything began to change. The life of a movie star is rarely like the life of an ordinary family. Months-long film shoots, premieres, trips around the world, all of it gradually distanced Eastwood from family life. While his career exploded, his marriage to Maggie began to fracture. The gaps in time, the pressures of fame, and the rumors in the entertainment world slowly created cracks that no one could fully repair. In the end, after many years of trying to hold it together, their marriage ended. Maggie Johnson left Eastwood's life, closing a long and important chapter in his story. But Clint Eastwood's romantic story didn't stop there. In the years that followed, he began a famous and also tragic relationship with actress Sondra Locke. Locke wasn't just Eastwood's partner for many years, she was also his co-star in several films. On screen, they formed a powerful and captivating pair. In real life, they lived together for more than a decade. To many people, this relationship seemed like a replacement for the broken marriage before it. But like so many Hollywood love stories, the relationship between Eastwood and Sondra Locke couldn't escape the pressures of fame, power, and personal differences. When their relationship ended in the late 1980s, it didn't end quietly. Instead, it became one of the most controversial breakups in Hollywood history. Locke sued Eastwood, accusing him of sabotaging her career and treating her unfairly in their relationship. The lawsuit dragged on for years, drawing media attention and turning a private breakup into a public scandal. For Eastwood, it was a difficult period. Though he continued working and maintaining his strong on-screen image, his personal life was exposed to the public in ways he never wanted. Private details, relationship conflicts all became topics for the press to discuss. For someone accustomed to living discreetly and speaking little, it was a painful experience. Throughout his life, Clint Eastwood also became the father of many children from different relationships. His family grew much larger than the traditional image of a Hollywood family. Eastwood's children grew up in different circumstances, with different stories. To the public, that sometimes became the subject of rumors and debates. But for Eastwood, family remained an important part of his life. even if it wasn't always perfect. The reality is that behind the image of a strong man on screen, Clint Eastwood repeatedly faced the loneliness that fame brings. When a person becomes too famous, they also become harder to approach in the world around them. Friends change. Relationships become complicated, and sometimes even the closest people gradually drift away. Eastwood has never been one to talk much about his emotions. He rarely shares his private thoughts with the press, but those who have worked with him often say that behind that cold exterior is a deep and quiet man carrying more memories and more losses than what audiences see on screen. Clint Eastwood's romantic life may have been full of turbulence, but it also reflects another truth about people living under the Hollywood spotlight. Success doesn't always bring happiness, and sometimes even the greatest legends have to face moments of loneliness that no one can share with them. The ups and downs in Clint Eastwood's personal life ran parallel to another painful period. His career began to stall. For many years during the 1970s and early 1980s, Eastwood had been one of Hollywood's most powerful stars. His films drew audiences around the world, and the image of the cold man with a gun in his hand had become an indispensable part of pop culture. But Hollywood is a ruthless place, where fame can vanish as quickly as it appears. By the late 1980s, the film machine had begun to change, and the name Clint Eastwood was no longer mentioned with the same reverence as before. His new films no longer achieved the massive success of his peak years. Some works failed to make a splash at the box office. Film critics, those who had already had mixed opinions about Eastwood since the Dirty Harry era, began writing colder reviews. They argued that Eastwood's style had become outdated, that his laconic hero image no longer fit a rapidly changing Hollywood. New action films with younger faces started dominating the box office, while Eastwood, once the icon of on-screen masculinity, was gradually seen as a relic of an old era. In newspapers and film magazines, the words "every star fears most" began to appear. Some critics wrote bluntly that the era of Clint Eastwood is over. Those statements weren't just comments on a failed movie. For an actor, they were almost a final verdict, a declaration that the industry they had devoted their life to no longer needed them. For Eastwood, those remarks weren't easy to accept. He had spent decades working tirelessly to build his name, from the days he was fired from Universal Pictures, through the persistent years on Rawhide, to the turning point with A Fistful of Dollars, and the explosion of Dirty Harry. All of it was the result of perseverance and effort. And now, after everything he had done, Hollywood was starting to look at him like a star whose time had passed. Many actors facing such a phase would choose to withdraw. Some accept that their era has ended and seek a different life outside of film. But Clint Eastwood has never been one to easily accept defeat. Throughout his life, he had grown used to being underestimated. When he was young, people said he could never become an actor. When he made cowboy films in Italy, people said it was a mistake. When he made Dirty Harry, people said he was dangerous. And now, as he entered middle age, they said he was outdated. But perhaps Eastwood understood something many others didn't. In Hollywood, fame doesn't always follow a straight line. It rises, then falls, and sometimes unexpectedly rises again. Instead of trying to chase new trends, Eastwood began thinking differently about his career. He no longer wanted to be just an action star. He wanted to tell deeper stories, stories that reflected what he had experienced in life. During that time, Eastwood kept working quietly, without fanfare, just as he always had. He directed his own films, experimented with new ways of storytelling, and gradually built a different reputation, not just an actor, but a serious filmmaker. But in the late 1980s, very few people believed that Clint Eastwood would achieve anything great again. In the eyes of many, he was just a legend of the past, and for a star who had once stood at the pinnacle of Hollywood, there was no harsher sentence than being seen as a relic of a bygone era. But what those critics at the time couldn't know was that Clint Eastwood hadn't yet said his final word. A bigger story, a comeback no one expected, was quietly taking shape behind the Hollywood lights. But Clint Eastwood has never been the type to accept having his story end the way others write it. When many believed the era of Clint Eastwood was over, he quietly prepared for a film that would later completely change the way Hollywood viewed him. In 1992, Eastwood stepped into a project he had held onto for many years, a dark, slow, and deeply contemplative script about aging, guilt, and redemption. The film was called Unforgiven. When Eastwood decided to direct and star in Unforgiven, many in the film industry expressed skepticism. This wasn't the glamorous cowboy movie audiences were used to. There were no invincible heroes or heroic gunfights. Instead, the film told the story of William Money, a retired gunslinger who had given up violence, living a quiet life after his wife's death, but forced to return to his old path when life became too hard. Money wasn't a hero. He was tired, burdened with guilt, and haunted by what he had done in the past. And to some extent, that story reflected Clint Eastwood himself. After decades of playing cold heroes on screen, Eastwood understood better than anyone the cost of violence, of power, and of time. In Unforgiven, he didn't try to create a new heroic image. Instead, he shattered the very myth he had once built. William Money was no longer the man with no name of the 1960s. He was a weary man, an aging man trying to live with the memories of his mistakes. The film was shot with a slow, contemplative rhythm, very different from many previous westerns. Eastwood focused on emotion, on silence, on the moments when the character had to confront his past. For many audiences, Unforgiven wasn't just a western. It felt like a farewell to an entire film genre. When Unforgiven was released in 1992, the initial reaction from audiences and critics quickly changed the atmosphere around Clint Eastwood. Those who had doubted him began looking at the film with surprise. This wasn't the work of a star whose time had passed. This was the work of a mature, profound filmmaker with full artistic control. Audiences embraced the film warmly. But even more notable was the reaction from critics, those who had once said Eastwood's era was over. They began writing entirely different reviews. Many critics called Unforgiven one of the greatest westerns ever made. Some even said Eastwood had redefined the entire genre. The peak of recognition came the following year, when Unforgiven won big at the Academy Awards. The film took home Best Picture, and Clint Eastwood received the award for Best Director. For Hollywood, this wasn't just a win for one movie. It was an acknowledgement that Clint Eastwood had far surpassed the image of a mere action star. The man who was once fired from Universal, once dismissed as a mid-tier TV actor, once declared by critics to have passed his prime, now stood on the Oscar stage as one of the most respected directors in the film industry. That moment held profound meaning for Eastwood. It wasn't just a personal victory. It felt like an affirmation that all those years of doubt, criticism, and being underestimated had finally mattered. Clint Eastwood hadn't just survived Hollywood, he had grown with it. After Unforgiven, Hollywood's view of Eastwood changed completely. He was no longer just the icon of Dirty Harry or the man with no name. He became a true artist, a visionary director, a storyteller who knew how to turn life experience into cinema. And the irony is that the film that salvaged Clint Eastwood's legacy was precisely the story of an aging man struggling to confront his past. Perhaps that's why Unforgiven wasn't just a movie. It was proof that even when the world thinks you're finished, the greatest chapter might still lie ahead. After the resounding success of Unforgiven, many believed Clint Eastwood had completed the greatest chapter of his career. For an actor and director who had turned 60 when Unforgiven was released, winning Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Director was enough to secure an eternal legacy in film history. Plenty of people thought Eastwood might choose to rest, enjoy his fame, and let Hollywood remember him as a legend who had completed his journey. But Clint Eastwood has never been one to stop when things are going well. In the many years that followed, he continued working steadily, directing quiet, contemplative, and emotionally rich films. And then, at the age of 74, he stunned Hollywood once again. In 2004, Eastwood directed and also starred in the film Million Dollar Baby. At first glance, this wasn't an easy project to become a major success. The film told the story of Frankie Dunn, an aging, lonely boxing trainer full of regrets, who reluctantly agrees to train a young female fighter named Maggie Fitzgerald. The story wasn't a typical sports movie. It was about hope, about an incomplete father-daughter bond, and about the painful decisions people sometimes have to make when facing fate. In Million Dollar Baby, Eastwood didn't try to create flashy boxing scenes. Instead, he focused on the characters' emotions, the loneliness of Frankie Dunn, Maggie's longing for recognition, and the special relationship that formed between two people wounded by life. The film carried a quiet, melancholic atmosphere, much like many of the works Eastwood made afterward. It wasn't an easy film to watch, but it was precisely that honesty and depth that moved audiences. When Million Dollar Baby was released, the reaction from critics and audiences quickly grew powerful. Many couldn't believe that a director at 74 could create such a refined and touching work. The film succeeded not only artistically, but also at the box office, proving that Eastwood could still connect with audiences across generations. The peak of success came at the Academy Awards in 2005. Million Dollar Baby won 4 major Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director for Clint Eastwood, Best Actress for Hilary Swank, and Best Supporting Actor for Morgan Freeman. For Eastwood, this victory held special meaning. It proved that Unforgiven's success wasn't a fluke. Clint Eastwood had truly become one of the greatest filmmakers of his era. The moment Eastwood stepped onto the stage to accept another Oscar moved many in the audience. A man who had once been fired by Hollywood for having no future, once seen as just a simple action star, now stood before the entire film industry as a master. All those years of doubt, criticism, and being underestimated seemed to have become an essential part of the journey that led him to that moment. But what was most astonishing wasn't just the number of awards Million Dollar Baby won. What was astonishing was that Clint Eastwood was still evolving his art at an age when most other directors had long retired. While many of his contemporaries left cinema or faded from the screen, Eastwood was still telling increasingly profound stories about humanity, about loss, and about life's difficult choices. With Million Dollar Baby, Clint Eastwood didn't just make a successful film. He achieved something very few artists in film history have done. He proved that creativity has no age, and that sometimes the second chapter of a life can be just as great as the first. After the triumphant success of Million Dollar Baby, many believed Clint Eastwood could finally stop. In his 70s, he had achieved nearly everything a film artist could dream of: fame, critical respect, and multiple Academy Awards. But Eastwood kept working, year after year, as if he understood that time waits for no one. And as he entered the later years of his life, he began carrying a burden that very few in Hollywood could understand. The burden of someone who has lived long enough to watch an entire generation disappear. Over more than 7 decades in the film industry, Eastwood had known and worked with countless actors, directors, and artists. Many of them had once been familiar faces in Hollywood, stars who once filled theaters with audiences. But time keeps moving. The names that once stood beside him on screen gradually left the stage of life. Some passed away from illness, some faded from the spotlight as old age arrived, and others quietly withdrew from the industry they once loved. For Eastwood, every time he heard that an old friend had gone felt like a reminder that the world he once knew was slowly vanishing. Hollywood has also changed in ways that the young man who arrived in Los Angeles in the 1950s could probably never have imagined. The old studios where Eastwood took his first steps in his career have disappeared or been replaced by new technologies. The Western films that once dominated the screen in the 1960s are now just memories. A new generation of actors has emerged, younger, faster, and trained in a film industry completely different from Eastwood's time. Sometimes, when looking at modern Hollywood, Clint Eastwood seems like a man who stepped out of another era. He isn't the product of flashy publicity campaigns or social media. He comes from a time when actors had to build their names themselves through every film, every failure, and every rare opportunity. While many young stars tried to keep up with the dizzying pace of today's Hollywood, Eastwood still works the way he always has, slowly, focused, and steadfast. The later years also brought him profound personal losses. Eastwood has lived long enough to watch many of his closest friends pass away. Some once stood beside him on set, sharing the tense moments and the joys of creative work. When those people disappear, the memories of them become part of the burden Eastwood carries. For a man who has lived through nearly a century of life, memories can sometimes be both a gift and a pain. But what is astonishing is that despite carrying all those losses, Clint Eastwood still doesn't stop. When many of his generation have long retired, Eastwood continues to step onto the set. He keeps directing, keeps telling stories about people, about regret, and about hope. His later films, quiet, contemplative, and full of emotion, reflect the very experiences he has accumulated over a lifetime. At an age when many choose to live in quiet retirement, Eastwood still stands behind the camera, still works with the focus he has maintained for decades. For him, cinema isn't just a profession. It is how he understands the world, how he confronts time, and how he faces the memories that never leave him. Perhaps that's why when people look at Clint Eastwood today, they don't just see an actor or a director. They see a witness to Hollywood history, a man who has lived through nearly a century of upheaval in the film industry, who has seen legends appear and disappear, and who still stands there, quietly working. And in that silence, Clint Eastwood carries the weight of a life longer than most of the stories Hollywood has ever told. And just when many believed that age would finally force Clint Eastwood to stop, he did something almost no one in Hollywood could imagine. When he turned 90, Eastwood still continued to stand behind the camera. In an industry where most directors had retired decades earlier at that age, Clint Eastwood still woke up every morning, stepped onto the set, and worked with his familiar calm. For him, cinema was never just a phase of life. It was his entire life. In 2018, Eastwood directed and also starred in the film The Mule. When the project was announced, many in Hollywood were stunned. Eastwood was nearly 90 at the time. Some even wondered if he had the health to complete a full-length film. But Clint Eastwood still showed up on set with his familiar demeanor, quiet, focused, and working faster than many younger directors. In The Mule, he played a lonely old man who unwittingly becomes a drug courier for a cartel. The film wasn't just a crime story. It was also a story about regret, about the years that had passed, and about the pain of a man realizing he had spent too much time on work and too little on family. Many audiences watching The Mule felt that Eastwood was telling part of his own story. The character in the film is a man who lived too long for his job, and only in old age did he realize the relationships he had missed. The authenticity in Eastwood's performance made the film special, because audiences knew the man on screen had truly lived through nearly a century of life. But Eastwood still hasn't stopped. In 2021, at the age of 91, he continued to direct and star in Cry Macho. Once again, Hollywood was surprised. In this film, Eastwood played an aging former rodeo star tasked with bringing a boy from Mexico back to the United States. The story unfolds slowly, almost like a reflective journey about old age, redemption, and what it means to be a man. Cry Macho isn't a loud film. It has no big action scenes or tense gunfights. Instead, it carries the quiet rhythm of a man who has lived long enough to understand that true strength doesn't lie in violence, but in patience and compassion. When audience see Clint Eastwood riding a horse slowly on screen at 91, they don't just see a film character. They see a real person facing old age with rare calm. In Hollywood, where everything often revolves around youth and innovation, the image of Clint Eastwood continuing to make films at 90 has become almost legendary. Many young directors say that just seeing Eastwood work is a huge inspiration. He doesn't need long speeches. His mere presence on set is enough to remind everyone that true passion isn't limited by age. Eastwood's collaborators often say he still works with astonishing discipline. He arrives on set early, prepares each shot meticulously, and rarely wastes time. Eastwood has always believed that simplicity is the key to cinema. He doesn't like shooting too many takes if the first one captures the needed emotion. That working style allows him to keep making films even when age makes everything more difficult. Looking at Clint Eastwood at 90 still standing behind the camera, many in Hollywood feel both amazed and moved. He is like an ancient tree, still standing firm in a forest that has completely changed. Those who once started their careers alongside him have long disappeared from the film industry. But Eastwood keeps telling stories, keeps doing what he has done for more than 70 years. Perhaps for Clint Eastwood, making films isn't a way to prove anything to the world. It is simply the way he continues to live. And so, even when the world expects him to rest, Clint Eastwood keeps working quietly, persistently, as if time never had the right to tell him to stop. And when the world looks back on Clint Eastwood's nearly century-long journey, people begin to realize that his story isn't just the story of a movie star. It is the story of an icon, a man who has walked through nearly all of modern Hollywood history and still stands there, silent, like a witness to time. After more than 7 decades of relentless work, Eastwood is now often called by an iconic name, the last cowboy of Hollywood. That title doesn't come just from the Western films he starred in during the 1960s. It comes from the entire journey he has traveled. From the unknown young man once fired by Hollywood to the icon of Dirty Harry, then becoming an Academy Award-winning director with Unforgiven and Million Dollar Baby. Clint Eastwood has gone through nearly every phase an artist in film could imagine. He has seen his career rise, collapse, and be reborn multiple times. But what makes Eastwood different isn't just those successes. What makes him a legend is his endurance. In an industry notorious for its brutality, where many stars shine brightly and vanish quickly, Clint Eastwood has kept existing. Not through noisy publicity campaigns, but through work. He has always believed that the only thing that truly matters is the next film. When one project ends, he rarely pauses for long. Eastwood keeps searching for another story, another character, another perspective on human life. Over time, his image has also changed. Clint Eastwood is no longer just the man with the gun and cold gaze from the Dirty Harry years. He has become a quiet storyteller, a director capable of looking deep into the dark corners of humanity, regret, redemption, and the difficult decisions every person must face. His later films aren't noisy adventures. They are like reflections on life stories told by a man who has lived long enough to understand that everything comes with a price. For many young filmmakers, Clint Eastwood is an icon not just for his success, but for his consistency. He has never tried to become someone else to keep up with Hollywood. As the industry changed, Eastwood kept his own style. He makes films the way he believes in, tells the stories he thinks are important, and lets audiences find their own meaning in them. Clint Eastwood's legacy, therefore, cannot be measured only by the number of films or awards. It lies in the way he works, in the perseverance he has shown for decades. It lies in the image of a man stepping onto the set every day, even when age has made everything harder. It lies in his continuing to tell stories even when the world thinks he has done enough. Perhaps that's why when people talk about Clint Eastwood today, they don't just talk about an actor or a director. They talk about a part of American cinema history, a man who has lived through many generations of Hollywood, from the era of classic westerns, through the explosion of action films to the modern era of cinema. And amid all those changes, Clint Eastwood still stands there. Not loudly, not ostentatiously, just simply continuing to work, like the last cowboy still riding across land that most others left long ago. And when looking back at Clint Eastwood's entire journey, people begin to understand that his story isn't one of perfection. It is a story of endurance. Eastwood has never been the perfect man that Hollywood often tries to build on screen. His life has been full of dark corners, failures, and controversial decisions. He was once a boy growing up in poverty during the Great Depression, living in a family that had to move constantly to find work. He was once a young actor outright fired by Hollywood because people believed he had no future. He went through years of being seen as outdated when critics said his era had passed, and in his personal life, he has also faced broken relationships, scandals, and moments of loneliness that fame could not hide. But if there is one thing that runs through Clint Eastwood's entire life, it is that he has never disappeared. When Hollywood said he could never become an actor, Eastwood kept trying. When his career seemed to end after years of being forgotten, he took the risk and stepped into Sergio Leone's world with a fistful of dollars. When critics attacked Dirty Harry, he didn't argue, he kept working. When Hollywood believed he was finished in the late 1980s, he answered with the masterpiece Unforgiven. And when many thought old age would force him to retire, Eastwood still stood behind the camera with films like $1 Million Baby, The Mule, and Cry Macho. At the age of 95, Clint Eastwood is not just a film legend. He is a living witness to nearly a century of Hollywood. He has seen his industry change from the classic sound stages of the 1950s through the spaghetti western era of the 1960s to the action film boom of the 1970s and 1980s and into the modern age of cinema. He has worked with generations of actors, some who were once legends, some who are still writing today's film history. And the strange thing is that through all those changes, Clint Eastwood has stayed. Perhaps that's why his story touches people more than any film ever could. Eastwood doesn't just represent success. He represents the ability to get back up after rejection. He represents moving forward when the world thinks you're done. In an industry where everything changes quickly and new stars appear every year, Clint Eastwood has proven that true strength doesn't lie in shining for a brief moment. It lies in continuing to exist. Those who have worked with him often say that Eastwood never tried to become a legend. He simply worked. One film after another, year after year, and over time, that very persistence turned him into one of the greatest figures in American film history. When Clint Eastwood walks slowly across the set at 95, that image carries special meaning. It isn't just the image of an aging director or actor. It is the image of a man who has lived through nearly a full century, carrying all the scars of life failures, losses, victories, and memories. Hollywood has changed. Generations of actors have come and gone. Film trends have appeared and disappeared. But Clint Eastwood still stands there, not because he never failed, but because he never left the fight. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson Clint Eastwood's life leaves behind. Some people become legends because of their victories, but Clint Eastwood became a legend because he never disappeared. The story of Clint Eastwood's life inspires awe and heartache when looking back on his nearly century-long journey. Behind the image of the last cowboy of Hollywood is a human being who has endured countless challenges few can imagine. From a boy growing up during the Great Depression, moving constantly with his family to find work, to a young man fired outright by Hollywood because he was deemed to have no future, Eastwood began life with far too many disadvantages. Then came the plane crash in 1951, when he had to jump into the freezing Pacific and swim miles in darkness to survive a moment that taught him how fragile human life truly is. After that were long years of being overlooked before the opportunity came with a fistful of dollars, followed by fierce controversies around Dirty Harry, and the late 1980s when many critics declared his career over. But Eastwood didn't disappear. He answered with the masterpiece Unforgiven and later Million Dollar Baby, proving a person can be reborn multiple times in life if they have enough persistence. What makes Eastwood's story heartbreaking is the price of that endurance. Broken relationships, the loneliness of fame, and living long enough to watch many colleagues pass away. But even in that loneliness, he kept working, even into his 90s with films like The Mule. For Americans, Clint Eastwood's life reminds us of a profound lesson. A person's true legacy isn't easy victories, but the ability to rise after rejection, to keep moving forward when the world thinks you're finished, and to hold on to dignity through every difficult phase of life. If the story of Clint Eastwood's extraordinary resilience has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and hit like, so we can continue exploring the inspiring journeys of other legends together. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where true stories of will and endurance are still waiting to be told.